demonstration. Good. We left the main demonstration and charged through the lawns and parking lots outside the Pentagon. When we came upon a line of soldiers with rifles and bayonets, we dodged around them until we came on other lines of soldiers who successfully blocked our progress. So we sat down, many of us through the entire night, as demonstrators often did during the 60s. Our objective, ill-articulated and vague, was to get into that building. What we might do there, most of us had no idea about, for we had no plans. Others, however, did have plans, as was the case at the Capitol last Wednesday. I don't know exactly what the plans at the Pentagon were, since I was not part of any group trying to carry it out. It might have been to set fires in the building, just as the American military was setting fires all over Vietnam. I don't know, even though I've written about the event in my book, Our Sixties. Does my participation in that event at the Pentagon make me sympathetic to those who attacked the Capitol last week? In no way. And it's worth thinking about why. First of all, a significant number of last week's crowd were plain and simple fascists. They wore shirts with anti-Semitic slogans. They carried Confederate flags. They promoted taking over the government by a violent mob organized for power, like the Nazi brown shirts of the 1920s and 1930s. And they swore fealty to a leader, a Führer, who egged on their viciousness. And what was their cause? Their cause was the myth that Trump had actually won the presidential election and was being kept from victory by fraud. They sought to maintain this total fiction, which had been dismissed by courts and voting officials of both parties all across America. In 1967, we did not need fictions to generate opposition to the American war in Vietnam. Every day, newspapers published the names of American soldiers killed in action, as well as the absolutely awful military claims about body counts of dead Vietnamese. Every day brought us photographs of terror. A photograph like the one of a naked girl burnt by napalm running down the middle of a road. Photographs of a captive Vietnamese soldier shot in the head by a South Vietnamese officer in front of TV cameras, like that. Water buffalo shot from American copters. Houses torched by American Marines. And women and children butchered in places like My Lai, and My Lai was not the only one. Nothing was made up. It was plain to see. Indeed, the military boasted of the effects of its firepower. Many of us there at the Pentagon had learned to confront the reality of racist cruelty in places like Mississippi. For my own part, I traveled to Mississippi in the summer of 1964 to teach and to show films in the large network of freedom schools the civil rights movement had established across the state. That opportunity was an unbelievable eye-opener for me and for many other volunteers. While I was the teacher, I actually was a student, learning from the kids in my classrooms about what it meant to be Black in America. As we all know, you can't have a conversation with a Black person today, especially with a man, without hearing about driving while Black or even walking while Black. In 1964, driving while Black wasn't an urgent issue for Freedom School students. They didn't have cars for the most part. They also didn't have access to decent schools, to libraries or pools, much less to the voting booth or to good jobs. That's why so many kids, guys, wanted to join the military. It's instructive to be reminded of the conditions for Black Americans in Mississippi back then, especially when Mr. Trump has basically called for throwing out the votes of Black citizens. For instance, in 1963, in 9 Mississippi counties, there were no Black people registered to vote. There are lots of eligible African-American citizens in those counties. The eligibility ranged from 1,071 to 5,172. No Black citizens registered in those counties. In 16 other counties, the number of Black people registered was under 10. In Amite County, 1 Black person was registered. 1. Black victims of crime were forgotten. A cotton gin in Amite County was the site of the murder before a dozen witnesses of Herbert Lee. Lee, who had been supporting efforts to register Black voters, was shot by E.H. Hurst, his neighbor and a member of the Mississippi legislature. Hurst was never prosecuted. Schools, libraries, pools, water fountains, and restaurants were strictly segregated when they were even available to Black people. I will never forget seeing, when we arrived in Jackson, Mississippi, water fountains marked Black, white. In fact, the schools, separate and altogether unequal in facilities, textbooks, and class size, taught segregation. A reader for 3rd and 4th graders prepared by the powerful White Citizens Council states, and I'm going to quote them at length here, "The Negro has his own part of town to live in. This is called our Southern way of life. Do you know that some people want the Negroes to live with white people? These people want us to be unhappy. They say we must go to school together. They say we must swim together and use the bathroom together. God has made us different, and God knows best. Did you know that our country will grow weak if we mix the races? White men worked hard to build our country. We want to keep it strong and free." That's from this reader for 3rd and 4th graders from the White Citizens Council. That's what the White Citizens Council wanted Mississippi schools to teach. The civil rights movement had a different idea in setting up freedom schools. Oppressed and demeaned though they were, my students had a distinctive, elaborately developed culture of music and dance, political insight, poetry, and personal aspiration. I needed to learn from them in order to teach them, and that's what I tried to do. I remember in Indianola, Mississippi, one blazing hot afternoon, talking about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima just 16 years before then. "Why we dropped the bomb on them Japs?" a young man interrupted. "And not them Germans." He quickly provided his answer. "Hey, ain't it obvious?" Leaving unsaid, but clear to all of us, what was obvious to him was who was considered white. The freedom schools, yes, helped educate the students who attended, but also those of us who, in theory, were their teachers. One major continuing lesson was displayed clearly a week ago Wednesday. As had been the case in Mississippi 1964, two very different directions opened before Americans. On the one side, 57 years ago, was the White Citizens Council, the Ku Klux Klan, the complicity of the local police in the murder of Black and white summer volunteers like James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner, and Andy Goodman in Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, Mississippi. On the other side was the movement with its freedom schools and the perilous efforts of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to register Black people to vote. The distinction between these two sides was stark and powerful. So last Wednesday, as I have said, one direction was American fascism, white supremacy, the violence and hate we have increasingly seen as the videos and photographs of the Capitol assault have surfaced. It's unbelievable to see what is coming out. The other direction had been displayed just a few hours before with the elections of the Reverend Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff to the U.S. Senate. I was up at 4 a.m. Wednesday morning, by which time it had become clear that both Democratic candidates were going to win their races. I thought that as modest supporters, we might have a modest celebration that evening. But then came the assault on the Capitol and everything it implied about the dangers facing American democracy, but also everything it exhibited about the violence white supremacy had been inflicting on Black and Native Americans since the 15th century. We didn't have our small celebration. Instead, I thought about the impact of Mississippi Summer 1964 on my life as an activist. My freedom school education led me in many directions in the movements of the 1960s, protesting for civil rights from Baltimore to Montgomery, Alabama, anti-war and anti-draft organizing, co-founding the Feminist Press in our house in Baltimore, as well as creating classrooms dedicated to serious social change. These are among the many activities I chronicle in my new book, Our Sixties. I was, I suppose, like a Jerusalem artichoke planted in your garden. If you've ever planted Jerusalem artichokes, you know that once put there, you never know where they will pop up the next year. Well, there were good reasons for this ubiquity. The received wisdom of the time was that civil rights, the war on Southeast Asia, much less the subjugation of women, the huge buildup of American military power, and the murderers spread of military weapons throughout America, that these were all separate issues having little or nothing to do with one another. Well, that has turned out to be nonsense. They are all, in the terminology we adopted in 1967, manifestations of illegitimate authority. Sorry, that's not a very ringing phrase like one man, one vote, or me too, or never again. But that's what we named it when we issued what we called the Call to Resist Illegitimate Authority on October 2nd, 1967. The call committed us to breaking the law, to urge young men to reject the draft, and to deny orders to fight in Vietnam. We hoped that the spectacle of Dr. Benjamin Spock, America's favorite baby doctor, the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, and hundreds of professors like me, writers and intellectuals, all agreeing to commit civil disobedience and foster draft resistance, that all these things would turn the American government away from its war policy. It did not, alas. Neither under Johnson and McNamara, nor for sure under Nixon and Kissinger. They plowed ever deeper into the big muddy, killing ever more Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laos, not to speak of Americans, first abroad and then, as at Kent State and Jackson State, at home. We had, in part, been inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., especially in his speech of April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church in New York, titled Vietnam, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. In beginning his speech, Dr. King insisted that my conscience leaves me no other choice. He offered a number of striking reasons why that was so. But perhaps the most revolutionary was this, and here I'm going to quote from Dr. King. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the Black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guaranteed liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. And so we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. And so we watch them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village. But we realized that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. That's from Dr. King. King might have cited the sentence that had begun circulating among young Black people as early as 1965. That sentence was, "No Vietnamese never called me nigger." In his speech, King went on to sketch the history of betrayal that marked French and American policy in Southeast Asia. But then he pushed beyond the particularities of the war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia into the underlying notions like American exceptionalism that shaped US military policy. And he called for a fundamental revolution in values necessary to bring about positive change. And here again, I'm going to quote from Dr. King. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust mores, and thereby speed the day when every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. That's Dr. King, quoting from the Bible. For some of us, a revolutionary spirit hostile to poverty, racism, and militarism was central to our condemnation of the war and its perpetrators. It sustained over many years the kind of work that led to electoral victories, not only in the presidential race, but in the elections of Warnock and Ossoff. And that revolutionary spirit stands in sharp contrast to the destructive, hate-filled outbreak that we all saw on Wednesday last. King was widely condemned for getting out of his supposedly proper lane, civil rights. The New York Times and the Washington Post wrote editorials saying that he had diminished his usefulness to his cause, to his country, and to his people. And the NAACP, as well as Ralph Bunche, strongly criticized him for linking two supposedly disparate issues. But Dr. King sustained and indeed broadened his condemnation of the war and his call to challenge the status quo. Just as it was for me personally, the civil rights movement of the late 50s and the early 60s became the seedbed of the other movements for change that we think of when we evoke the term the 60s. Even if our phrase, illegitimate authority, has faded from the script, the ideas behind it remain convincing. Now, what are those ideas? First of all, change in the United States begins by confronting racism. Racism is not only the original sin of American history, it has been and remains still the main wall blocking progressive change in our society. No surprise that so many Confederate battle flags were carried by those attacking the Capitol last week. Racism is a social pandemic for which there seems not yet no well-developed vaccine, at least not yet. The underlying story of the 60s, as I tell it, is the ongoing struggle against the institutions of racial injustice. That effort, first of all, shaped the personal experience of the young leaders of the 60s movement, a kind of training ground for the young and now not so young people who helped to bring about positive changes in America. In providing a model for activists, the fight against racism also stimulated change in all other political and social domains. It provided what I have called a seedbed for the flourishing of the movement. I have argued that I first encountered Black Lives Matter in Mississippi in 1964. But you might ask, it wasn't founded at Black Lives Matter until 2013. Well, yes, it's an organization. But Black Lives Matter is, in fact, the most recent and remarkably widespread manifestation of the centuries old struggle against racism, especially in financial institutions, law enforcement, and schools in America. A major goal of my teaching in the 60s, and especially after, as I illustrate in my book, was always to find texts and pedagogies that helped students think about what matters and who matters. Did it matter that students, as in a basic English course at Smith College that I had been assigned to teach, that students read only work by white men? Yes, it mattered whether students read Gwendolyn Brooks as well as T.S. Eliot, James Baldwin as well as James Joyce. Who we encounter in literature and on the tube, as well as in daily life, significantly affects who and what it is important to see and care for, as we are learning all too well in trying to respond to this pandemic. But in my view, to make Black lives really matter forces us to consider and act upon other basic issues. Racial inequality cannot be addressed, much less changed, by dealing only with race. Yes, we need to tackle the organization and funding of police, but also our overfed military. We need to figure out how to change an economic system under which billionaires pay $750 in tax to Uncle Sam and then sail off in their multi-million-dollar yachts while leaving hardworking and often minority people vulnerable to poverty, the coronavirus, and our crazy quilt health system, healthcare system, non-care often. And that does not begin to speak of the need to deal with global warming, which, if we do not produce change, will leave the earth with only faint traces of human life. To solve the social and economic questions raised by Black Lives Matter will, in my view, require focusing on changing the unquestioned domination of the market, what might be called market fundamentalism, an ideology as dangerous to achieving human equality as other forms of fundamentalism. Which returns me to that other event of last Wednesday, the victory of Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff in the Georgia Senate election. It is, from my point of view, a very good thing that the Democrats will control the United States Senate. A good thing, but not in and of itself an adequate conclusion of the efforts to achieve change. One thing we learned in the 60s, some allies, under the veneer of moderation, turned out to be adversaries. Many of us who saw ourselves as liberals discovered with horror that those with whom we shared many social and cultural values were the very people directing the illegal and repulsive war in Southeast Asia. Those liberals, often our teachers or even college classmates, would strongly oppose segregationists like George Wallace or Bull Connor. But they would also napalm farm girls in Vietnam. Change in one area of American politics, voting rights, say, did not guarantee anything like a compassionate foreign policy. protection of the environment, or support for the equality of women. I have nothing but admiration for Stacey Abrams and the other Black women who led the campaign to register and motivate a winning coalition of voters in Georgia and elsewhere. But that victory is only a beginning. To achieve the goals of a Green New Deal, of Me Too, of the coalition to stop gun violence, and most of all, of Black Lives Matter, will require a patient and ongoing struggle. A struggle not only against those who would impose a fascist regime on America, but a struggle with our friends and allies to carry yet further, to the commitment to building a nation. As Lincoln didn't quite put it, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men and women are created equal. That goal, as I argued in my book, Our Sixties, might best be named socialism. But that is a further discussion which I shall not try to pursue at this very moment. I thank you for your attention,